Okay, so now what we're going to do is make the dough first for the bread, and we measure out 400 grams of the AP flour and 200 grams of the whole grain flour. We'll be making 2 loaves. And one of the differences here is that you can go ahead, I found you can go ahead and mix the salt in right away. You don't have to wait for it. This is going to be 12 grams of salt. So let me measure that out here. I always measure the salt out separately because in case you mismeasure it, it's really hard to get it out of the flour that's mixed. But now this is 12 grams of salt. So I'm just putting that right on top, and I'm going to mix it all in because it has not, it really, there is no deleterious effect, shall we say, of the salt on the yeast culture. Okay, so that's the dry ingredients. Now it calls for 460 grams of distilled water. Which goes in here. There you go. Always put a few extra grams in. It never hurt to have a little too much water, and it also there's always some left in the bowl when you pour it out. So now we're mixing the wet and the dry ingredients. And for this, you don't need to do an entire thorough mixing, because we're going to do next is the auto-lyse part of the process, which basically means you just let this stuff sit by itself for about 15 or 20 minutes, and it will continue to hydrate. The water will just make its way through the dry ingredients of the dough. So that is fine. It doesn't have to come together as a ball. You'll take care of that in a bit. So now what we do is we take the second build, which again has been sitting out all night, fermenting. And this is what it looks like when it's been out all night. And so what we do is we basically just scrape it out of and plop it on top of the dough like that. And this gives you an opportunity to wash another dish while this stuff is just doing its thing. Okay, so we cover it up and just let it sit for 15 minutes. All right, so now that the auto-lyse is over, the next step is to actually make the dough, and I have a little trick, and I keep a bowl of warm water next to it so I can keep my hands hydrated and clean. And as you'll see, the dough underneath the second build is fully hydrated now, so the point is to actually mix the two together. So that's what I'm going to do, starting off with the dough scraper. And even though it may not look like the second build is mixing in with the rest of the dough, I can assure you that it is. And the way I can assure you is that I sometimes make a dough that actually has 2 different shades to it. The dough is much lighter than the second build. So I can see, because of the difference in colors, that one is actually mixing in with the other. And so you get to this point, and you get your hands very wet, and then you start basically folding over and over and over again to make sure that the second build, which is, of course, the leavening for the dough, is mixed in with the rest. So basically you're just giving it, the yeast colony, one more huge burst of food and water. And then when you've gone around about 3 or 4 times, it's nice and wet. And you rinse your hands in the water, come back and turn it over. And then that's done. That's the dough mixed up. And it's going to stay like that for a covered in a warm spot for an hour.
I do this over here at my stove. It has pilot light, so the stovetop is pretty warm. And if we let it sit here for an hour before we do the stretch and fold, that's generally enough time to let it rise. Now, if you have a shelf right here at the top of your oven, you can leave it here. It's not quite as warm. It'll take a little bit longer time to ferment, which is fine. Or if you want to let it rise at a slightly warmer temperature, you can do so in the baking chamber itself with just the pilot light on. Either way, it works fine.